Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa.
Hi there, and thanks for listening. If you're enjoying our podcast and have a recommendation about someone you think we should have on to share their voice and journey with the world, by all means, let us know. It could be an aid worker, monastic, author, journalist, scholar, resistance leader, really anyone with some tie or another to the ongoing situation in Myanmar. To offer up a name, go to our website, insightmyanmar.org, and let us know. But for now, just sit back and take a listen to today's episode.
Sabe manusa, sabe vinipatika. A lack
of conscience is all it takes to diagnose yourself with ignorance.
Dukkha muchantu yatalada sampatito mavigachantu kamasaka.
For this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast, we're talking to Venerable Vimala. This is a nun from Belgium, and thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us for this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast.
Very happy to be here.
Right. So let's get right into one of the recent activities that you did. After that, I definitely want to take some time learning a bit about your time in robes and your connection to Myanmar. But I think it's just good to get right in directly with one of the topics that is a bit sensitive for some people and also a bit important in terms of the steps that you've taken. And we're speaking, of course, about the Overturned Alms Bowl movement, which is something that you got off the ground in among monastics outside of Myanmar in solidarity. So can you take a moment to explain to us first, what is the significance of an overturned alms bowl and what led you to begin this response to the coup as you did?
Well, the significance of the overturned alms bowl is that the alms bowl is our way of getting nourishment by going on Pindapata, so that's on alms round, and then people put food in the bowl. And if you overturn the alms bowl, you refuse the food from a specific or a group of lay people, supporters. And that can only be done if they are not behaving correctly. And that's why it's so important to this sign is, especially in traditional Buddhist countries, a very important sign to say, like, we don't agree with what you're doing, you're breaking the precepts, or something that they might have done that is just not correct. In relation to the current coup in Myanmar, it's a little bit more complex, and not all monastics would agree on using that symbol for that purpose. But I think it is important, and an important sign to show that it's not just the monastics within Myanmar, but also in the whole world who simply do not agree with this.
Thank you for that. And digging a bit deeper into this symbolic act on the part of monastics and the Sangha, where does this idea come from? Is there historical precedent, or is there anything in Buddha's life which indicates this act of overturning the alms bowl as a way of rejecting alms and support, and thereby merit on the part of the person who wants to give it, as kind of a criticism of their bad behavior?
It is mentioned in the Vinaya, so it's something that is already mentioned in the early texts. So it's also like something already over 2,000 years old. So that's basically where it comes from.
Right. And you mentioned that doing this today is somewhat controversial. Can you share a bit why it's controversial and those people that would push against this act, where they're coming from and why they have a problem with it?
It's not so much doing it today as in doing it in these circumstances of, in the case of the coup in Myanmar, because it is usually something that you do against a specific lay person who that you come across on your alms round, and somebody who might want to put something in your bowl and you refuse it. Of course, in this case, you can't do that because we're not on Pindapata in Myanmar and getting alms from the lay people there or from the military and soldiers there. And because that is wasn't possible actually for many of the monastics in Myanmar to do so, because of the repercussions they might be facing by doing that, us doing it as a symbolic act on their behalf was trying to send this signal to the military regime that we do not agree with this.
Right. And you referenced that it was seen as controversial by some people. What was their reason or grounding for why they would have an issue with it?
Because it's not part of, exactly as it is in the Vinaya, against one person or several people who actually are trying to put something in your alms bowl and you're refusing it. So it was a far more symbolic act, and that is not actually mentioned in the Vinaya as such.
Right, I see. And the Vinaya, of course, is the monastic standards of the regulations and rules the Buddha laid down for how monastics are to act. And so you're saying that in referencing the Vinaya set down by the Buddha 2,500 years ago, there are examples and guidelines of avoiding of not accepting food from a particular individual donor that one can be referred to, and that might be legitimate still today, but taking that example and extrapolating to make it a symbolic gesture that's a sign of solidarity on one hand with the democracy movement and those monks that are facing hard times, and on the other hand, a condemnation of the wider Burmese military, that making this kind of conceptual leap is something that those more strict traditionalists have some kind of problem with. Is that fair to say?
Exactly, yes.
Right. And so we understand now, and I should mention, we're trying to stretch this out and really explain this step by step for those listeners that are completely unfamiliar with Buddhist traditions, and especially monastic traditions. It could take some time to wrap your mind around why the subtleties of these rules are so important, and something so small can bring about such a contentious discussion. So wanting to make sure that understanding is there for everyone. So from their side, I hope we understand now why some people would find this problematic or controversial, making this conceptual leap. Now, explaining from your side, in what ways do you see this first as being justified and allowable, and then second as significant and important?
I feel that it's justified in this case, as the monastics in Myanmar were no longer able to do this because they might face penalties if they did. and therefore we felt it's justified to show this as a symbol of solidarity and to show you're not alone. There's other monastics in the whole world that are behind you, even though you might not have much contact with them. They are there.
Right. Yeah, that's really beautiful. Have you received a response from people in Myanmar who have seen what you've been doing and how you've been sharing? Have they been able to see the results of your work?
Yes, also the Democratic Voice of Burma has broadcast this movement, and a lot of the images that a lot of the pictures that we collected, and also I understand that it's been broadcast into Myanmar, and I've also had a lot of response, not quite often, not directly, but via various other channels of people that really appreciated what we were doing.
Right. That's great. On the other hand, you mentioned that it has been a controversy among some sectors. What shape has this controversy taken? Has it been just people kind of grumbling or having private conversations, or has it spilled out into something of more of a public debate or discourse about the appropriacy of this?
I have not seen any public debate about it, so it's more like letters we received personally.
Right. So let's take a minute just to understand how this movement actually took off. Now we have a theoretical grounding for what you did, why you did it, where it derived from, and some of the response, both positive and negative. Let's learn a bit about the movement itself. So describe as someone who really got this off the ground, take a moment to describe your initial reaction to what was happening in Myanmar, your feeling as a monastic, and then starting to lay the ideological groundwork for what something like this movement would be, and then what happened as you started to take it off the ground and get other people involved.
Well, when the coup happened, I was in retreat. So I didn't actually learn about it until somewhere half April. And so I was quite shocked because I had hoped that things would improve in Myanmar, even though it might have been a long road. But now it seems to have taken 10 years back in time again. And I wanted to do something, and I was very inspired by a picture that was going around, and I think it was in a local paper here, I can't quite recall anymore, of some monks in Myanmar sitting on the steps of their monastery, making the V sign with tape over their mouth, and the first one, which I take to be the abbot, was holding his alms bowl upside down. And I find that a very, very powerful symbol, and I wanted to do something, but I wasn't quite sure how to do that. So I participated in a Metta for Myanmar session that was led by a Sayalay from Myanmar. This was online, directly broadcast from Myanmar. And there I also met a Burmese laywoman who lives in Europe. And I contacted her and asked her for help. And I also contacted my friend Ayayashi. And this laywoman in Europe, she was also involved in another group that was helping to raise funds to get help to the people in the non-violence movement in Myanmar. So that's why I thought she might be a good person to help me with setting this up. I have no clue about things like Facebook, so I felt that might be necessary to have something like that. So that's also what I asked for her. And I contacted my friend Ayayashi, who is a Bhikkhuni in the Tibetan tradition, who's also an activist and who runs a charity in India, and who is also a close friend of Bhikkhu Bodhi. And so together we actually started off writing a little letter on that we were going to send to all our monastic friends or anybody who we had an email address of, and post on Facebook and various other channels. And that also included this iconic picture of the monks in Myanmar. So that's basically how we started.
Right, and you're referring to the picture of the monks at Myangtong Monastery in Mandalay, a famous picture of their response in the initial weeks following the coup, where there was still more hope and optimism of putting tape on their mouths to show their inability to express themselves freely. And there's since been reports, I'm not sure how confirmed they are, but reports that many of those monks in the picture have unfortunately disappeared, and perhaps the military took their vengeance on them. But this was the inspiration of wanting to show some kind of solidarity, some kind of support from monastics, from Buddhist monastics in different parts of the world. And so this led to the idea of doing this symbolic act of showing the alms bowl upside down, inferring that they did not accept, that one would not symbolically accept alms as a monastic from members of the military that were engaged in this very, very unskillful action, to say the least. So as you got this off the ground, what happened? How did you start this, what really became a movement, and how did other people come to be involved in it?
Well, we started, like I said, with just an email to all our monastic friends. And we had set up a special email address for it as well. And a first picture that came in was from Bante Analayo. At first, I was really afraid that nobody would want to help. But when this picture from Bante Analayo came in, who is somebody I very much respect, one of the greatest monastic scholars that we have in the world, I felt reassured. And then very shortly afterwards, Bhikkhu Bodhi joined in, and also other members of the monastic community where he's staying. And a lot of bhikkhus and bhikkhunis all over the world sent in pictures. And so that was very lovely to see their support. A lot of people from different traditions as well, Tibetan traditions, Zen traditions, not just Theravada, who all wanted to support this. One thing that happened also with this picture of the monks, as you mentioned, that a lot of them, or most of them, have disappeared. So something happened also to our Facebook account with that picture. That picture was on the heading of our friends or our group. I don't quite know how these things work, but it was at the heading of our group. And the admin of this group had her Facebook banned at some point. The pictures were removed everywhere, and without explanation. And after a while, the admin, she could get her Facebook account back. I think she probably talked to some people in Facebook who also understood that she was not posting harmful content. But yeah, so there was something going on around this picture. And what we did then is post this picture everywhere again, just to say, it's like, please keep this picture somewhere, at home or anywhere. Just post this as many times as you can, just so that these monks are not forgotten. So that is another thing that happened during this movement.
And where can one find the photos that you've collected of all these monastics around the world who are turning their alms bowl upside down in solidarity with the democracy movement and monastics in Myanmar?
You can find it on our Facebook group called Sangha for Myanmar. And I think the Facebook link will be posted below this.
So this was really an example of bringing the practice and your background as a monastic into very pressing social issues that are occurring in the world. Of course, there are different views of to what degree practitioners as well as monastics should be engaged in the world, where they should be pulling back. It's something we've talked about in interviews here. For you personally, if one can say this is a part of engaged Buddhism, have you done social actions like this before as a monastic?
Not so much in this extent, but I have helped a organization called Compassionate Hands in Myanmar before. That was before I was a monastic, actually. And I'm also sometimes helping Bhikkhu Bodhi's organization in Germany called MIA, Mitgefühl in Aktion. As well as my friend Ayayashi and her charity in India.
Right. Yeah. And digging a bit deeper into that, looking at Myanmar specifically, can you tell us a bit about your relationship with the country? This could include your time actually spent visiting the country or meditating or practicing there. Also, your experience with Burmese traditions that could be outside of the country. Just whatever interaction you've had either with Myanmar, with Burmese people on your path, or with with different spiritual traditions and teachers from a Burmese lineage.
I started meditation. The first official meditations I did with the Gwenka tradition, and specifically here in Belgium. And so I have a big debt of gratitude towards this tradition who makes things available, makes meditation available for everybody, free of charge, just on a basis of donation. And I think that was such a beautiful gift to give to the world. But at some point I wanted also to see this country and also to become a monastic. So in 2008, January 2008, I went to Myanmar and I became a CLA in a monastery called Te Pute, which is north of Yangon. And so I ordained there as a CLA for about a month, but this was a very difficult time because this was still before Aung San Suu Kyi came to power. And there had just been the monks' uprising in September of the year before. So they were not very keen on people coming to ordain as monastics from outside, from Western countries, because you might be spies or journalists or something. And so it was a very tense time. And I'll tell you some of the stories that happened there. I was ordained. At that time, it was fairly simple. You would come to the monastery, you'd ask for ordination, and you'd be ordained at the same day. And that evening, the sayadaw there, he asked me to come forward and sit next to him. And on the other side was a monk. And that monk spoke English, and he was to translate for me. And the talk he gave me, or the discourse he gave me for my practice, was very typical. And it's one of the suttas in the Samyutta Nikaya, which basically says, like, well, if you want to go into samadhi, into deeper concentration, deeper meditation, you should not talk about the government, not talk about the generals. And so it went on and on for a little bit like that. So I thought, well, this is a bit peculiar. But what I also understood is that there might be spies among the people listening and wanting to know what this sayadaw, who is having all these Western monastics coming, what he is teaching them and what they are talking about. So, it was very much alive at that time. Also, there was a lot of fear. So it was a bit of a strange time, although I didn't really get all of that because I didn't speak the language, but especially also things I've heard from friends later on is that it was just very tense time. So after 1 month, I had to leave because I couldn't get an extension on my visa. And I tried again the next year in 2009, saying again the same thing. I couldn't get a long-term visa and I had to leave. And in 2010, I thought, oh, now I'm really going to go and I'm going to try and get a meditation visa and I'll stay for longer. I'll stay for a year. And I also had collected some money for Compassionate Hands in Myanmar. I'm not actually sure if it still exists, Compassionate Hands, but we had collected money in cash to bring across the border. That's the reason being that otherwise, like, a lot of the money would go to the government, which we didn't want. We wanted it to go to the people that really needed it. And 5 days before my flight, my doctor said, no, you can't go because you most likely have cancer. So, then there was a whole rush of like, what to do with all this money. And luckily I had a friend who wanted to become a monk and who was already going there. We were going to go together. And so I managed to get the money all to him, and he took it over the border and he took it to the people behind Compassionate Hands. And I stayed at home. I meditated for 2 months, then had an operation, and it turned out to be not cancer, but an operation anyway. And the nuns in a small monastery in the south of Germany, Anandya Vihara, invited me to come and recuperate there. So I did that, and my life took a very different turn. I've never been back to Burma after that because I asked for ordination in that monastery, and that's where I stayed and where I became Anagarika.
I see. Thank you. That's a really beautiful story of your background. And going to the start of your story, you talk about it's quite a stunning scene, actually, coming there for a spiritual renunciation. And in the initial talk giving to you after your ordination, it's a reminder not to talk about politics. And this is actually a very clever way that it's being discussed, because of course the Buddha was very clear that there is needless chatter, and there are things about the world and talking about the happenings of the world, whatever they might be, that are just not exactly skillful or conducive to waking up and to gaining higher spiritual states. And one has to let go of certain kinds of topics of conversation that are just not skillful anymore. But this instruction from the Buddha is being applied here in this case in a very specific way. So it's not just talking about needless talk in general, but it's very specifically saying not to be concerned and engaged about certain things that are happening in the country. And politics, of course, is code word for a lot of things. When politics is a clever word to use, because by saying politics, it can mean like, this political leader and this one, and these kind of mechanisms of how of kind of this messy political discourse that's going on. And okay, I don't need to be involved in that. But when you're talking politics in Myanmar, it's actually code word for talking about human rights and talking about the harm being done to vulnerable communities and talking about some of the ethnic minorities and their status. Saying that one is not going to talk about politics is really an implicit kind of nod or understanding that one will not talk about human rights. At least that's how I've come to understand it living in Myanmar. So as you take yourself back to this time, I think when you were going through that ceremony, there were so many things that must have been going on in your mind. The forces that brought you to Myanmar, the dedication to the teacher, the desire to want to be a good yogi and a good monastic, and not impose on this monastery that was taking you in and that obviously would have its own risks at play, but also coming from the West, holding progressive values. I imagine that moment must have brought about a certain tension and uncertainty in how exactly you respond and engage from being put in that place. Or at least that's my thought. I'm wondering, as you think back now on that moment, what comes to mind, and how do you see those different forces at play in the moment?
Yes, it was quite a strange thing, actually. And you also start to wonder, it's like, well, what is actually this Buddhism? This is a Buddhist country. And the Buddha had all these lovely values of compassion and kindness. And how can this happen in a Buddhist country? And at some point after the last day, then in 2008, when the day before I had to leave, I went for a walk around together with a friend. And we got lost. And we met some people. We didn't speak the language. All we had was a key hanger, which had the name of the monastery in Burmese script on it to show people where we were from. And these people were incredibly poor. They lived in small bamboo huts, but they invited us to come and have tea with them. They would give us bananas and all kinds of things. And eventually they also found somebody who could bring us back to the monastery. And yes, so finally we got back to the monastery, and this man that had brought us, my friend wanted to give him some money, and he was very upset. I mean, he's a very poor man, but he was like, no, he could not accept this money from this rich Western person for bringing them back. And I thought, like, gosh, these people, they are so poor, and they still just want to do things because it's the right thing to do, and not for money. And that was just such an eye-opener also for me. And I think maybe that has also something to do with why this could happen, why a military regime like this could take hold of such a country, because like people don't protest too much, actually. They're very, very, very kind and loving, and they don't want to do something that might hurt another person. And it sounds a bit strange maybe, because I think the Buddha never taught pacifism. But I think that is what is happening. I might be wrong, but that's sort of what the idea that I got.
And I think it's also made a confusing situation over the years for foreign practitioners and meditators and monastics in just knowing exactly how to engage. I mean, I think about my own introduction to Myanmar when I went the first time in 2003 and was also a Goenka meditator. And coming from that tradition, I was hearing consistently from the teachers in that tradition, as well as Goenka himself, and seeing and hearing speeches that he had said previously that had been recording or reading writings, that was a consistent injunction, not advice, but injunction, a demand really, that one does not get involved in politics. And again, politics is kind of the code word for human rights, for speaking about or being concerned about the wider damage that the military rule was causing. And being a young and impressionable Westerner at the time, I took it as I was hearing that advice more than I was actually learning and engaging about the realities of the country at the time. And so I took that really to heart, and I know a lot of meditators from that tradition as well came in with that mindset of being really clear that like I am not taking that advice as really like a guidance to being closed off to wanting to hear that reality, and really trying to separate artificially, like, no, I'm not going to look at these things. I'm not going to talk about them. I'm not even going to be concerned about them, because my reason for coming here is one of practice. And that is a separation that I had been instructed to make. And so I was striving to make it. And, I think, and I say that, as I say that now, I think it does come across somewhat critically, because since I've been engaged in the country more, I've really seen the damage and the harm of trying to separate those two things out, and really trying to be disengaged and almost uncaring or detached from the pain and reality that this military rule was causing. At the same time, it's really a sensitive and delicate thing to understand properly, because you also have to look at the only way that these monasteries and meditation centers were operating were to stay clear this way. And this is a very evil, entrenched organization that has been in power for some time. And many of these centers and monasteries were faced with a decision to either engage or speak out, in which they would have no presence whatsoever and couldn't have any kind of impact, or they would have to make somewhat of a deal with the devil, and they'd be able to operate their Dhamma courses, their meditation courses, but they'd have to make this kind of false distinction and encourage this kind of false distinction in their students to really separate the human rights abuses and the harm that was being perpetuated in the country with just purely this spiritual practice, and that and that was the choice they had. And I know for Goenka, he had a hope that by more people practicing his tradition and his teachings, that this might somehow start to change more hearts in the country, and would encourage a way of sending metta to those generals and wishing that they not harm others, and that they come out of whatever suffering, so they also bring those they harm out of suffering. So it was a more indirect kind of way to go about it. It wasn't a complete ignoring it. It was just a methodology of, let's try to change one heart, individual by individual, and hope that was going to create a wave or a cascade. And that would be, I think, in my understand at least, that would be a kind of indirect path towards creating a greater change for good in the country, rather than speaking about some of these abuses or taking action directly, which would have immediate ramifications, such as the action you took of overturning an alms bowl back in the day. That would have been unthinkable, and would have had you on the blacklist for good. And so I'm just going into length, fleshing out this argument just to show how delicate it is, that it continues to be, in how one looks at being able to engage in the spiritual practice and welcome these teachings without imposing this wider societal and worldly view, which even the Buddha was cautioning against, while at the same time being someone who cared about the welfare of others, was not selfishly just on a spiritual path and ignoring the plight and the suffering of those around in that worldly reality, and where these come together. And it can be really tough to figure out and to do so in a skillful way with all these different conditions. So I wonder what your thoughts are in hearing that. As someone who had to tangle with this directly and interact with it, what are your thoughts on how to do this?
Yes, I completely agree with that. As the things that you've been in Myanmar far longer than I have. So because I am also blacklisted, so to say, for another reason, namely that I'm a bhikkhuni. And bhikkhunis don't exist according to the Myanmar Sangha, which is quite ironic that me doing this alms bowl movement, and also many bhikkhunis from around the world joining in and showing their support is also a way of showing, it's like, well, we are going to put aside our whatever there is between us and just support you because we feel it's the right thing to do, rather than to go about like, oh, well, you don't accept us as bhikkhunis and therefore we're not going to care about you. While you were talking, I thought of another incident that happened while I was in Myanmar, and that was a woman who came to give alms at a monastery, and she wanted specifically to give alms to the Western nuns. And I was fairly new there, so I didn't know the ins and outs, but I was told by a friend who was also a nun there that she was actually the wife of a military person, and she had been refused to give alms at the time to the monks. So she wanted to at least get some merit by giving it to the Western nuns. And we did accept it, actually. Also, because it was very clear that she was suffering and that she so much wanted to make some good merit. And also that the whole thing isn't so black and white. A lot of soldiers didn't have much of a choice. They needed to have some job to make ends meet. And so it wasn't always so black and white, this whole thing. And of course, it never is. But so, yeah, I can understand also Goenkaji's point of view is to try and bring the Dhamma into Myanmar more and more, send compassion, etc. I understood that Goenkaji also managed at some point to get his meditation teachers into insane prison to teach meditation to the prisoners. That is a very big step. Mm-hmm. And that is something quite extraordinary. Also in Te Pute, where I was, the second year I went back in 2009, and you probably will know about this, they were building a stupa. And the stupa was being built by prisoners.
Yep, right. 50 prisoners in blue. I remember that.
Exactly. And some of the Westerners that came there, they couldn't understand that. It was like, why is this side like employing these prisoners and making them do work, and how can you do that? But I understood that more as an act of compassion. Right. And the societal said, well, otherwise they're going to send them to work on some road somewhere in the middle of nowhere in the heat and with hardly any food. And here they're getting shelter, they're getting good meals, they're getting food, and they're doing something that makes merit. And for them, that's important. So I saw it more as an act of compassion for those prisoners, and also a way of, also in a way helping to bring the Dhamma into the government in that way.
Right. And I remember that. I was there I did a self-course while those prisoners were doing work, and it was a very conflicting kind of thing, because everything you say is correct, that they were better off at that monastery, that Sayadaw had some special kind of relationship with someone in some part of government, maybe in the prison sector, but I think had come and taken a course and was really impressed with him, and so wanted to offer this. And in one sense, it was kind of good all the way around. The monastery got to have work done and improvement, and the prisoners were able to do something, at least for those that were Buddhist and supported that, were able to, and maybe prisoners who came it was voluntary. They got to choose if they wanted to go there or somewhere else, and they were probably taken care of better there. And so all these things are kind of for the favor, but at the same time, it was just kind of awkward being in a monastery where there was basically a chain gang. I mean, it was basically they were wearing semi-prison uniforms and they were working all day long. And to be sitting here in silence, taking this course and seeing these prisoners that were the ones contributing to the beautifying and the construction of the monastery, it was one of those things again, which just left you feeling a bit conflicted and certainly understanding their side of how this is probably the best option for them of all the options they have in front of them, and yet also just feeling like, well, this is still just kind of odd that somehow the Sayadaw got, free labor or semi-free labor from 50 prisoners to just come and build this monastery that then I'm enjoying. But I think this also speaks to just the overall complexity that is Myanmar, and that is Burmese Buddhism within Myanmar.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just such a complex situation that I find it, at least for me, to make a judgment on these things, I find very, very complex. Although when it comes to like the military killing people, maiming people, torturing people, then of course that is very clear, that part. But the whole political thing about what is right and wrong, that's sometimes a little bit blurred.
Yeah, it really is. If we could just take a step back and look at who Sayadaw was, Thebyu Toya Sayadaw, the one that you ordained with. I went to the monastery many times as well then. He was kind of like a rising star that came from nowhere and just shot into supernova overnight. I mean, he went from being a name that no one had heard of, and just even there was a select group of foreign practitioners that had heard through him one way or the other and started flocking there. And then he attracted more attention within Burmese society and is now quite well known there. He was previously a teacher, even as a monk, in the Goenka system, which was quite unusual at that time to have a monk assistant teacher. And he then stepped down to start his own tradition that was, and for a time it had a lot of enthusiasm among Goenka meditators. It was known kind of as a Goenka monastery, which was not quite accurate, but it was known as a place where practitioners from the Goenka lay community could come and ordain and basically practice something that was more similar than to the Goenka technique than most of the other monastic traditions out there. So it got this kind of moniker as a Goenka monastery where one can come and ordain and still more or less stay in the tradition. But it was a bit more complicated than that. But in any sense, can you share a bit about where you heard of W. Sayadaw and what made you want to make such a dramatic and drastic decision to renounce and ordain under the Sayadaw, and then what your experience was learning under him and in that kind of practice environment?
Well, it's exactly as you mentioned. I was a Goenka practitioner. I had heard about Sayadaw when that was still in the very beginning days, I think. I was, I think, the third Western person who came there to ordain, even though I only stayed for 1 month at that time, and there were 2 nuns who had been there for a year at that time when I came. And yeah, it was exactly how you described this. Is I had asked also my teachers within the Goenka tradition here in Europe, and if I could go there, and they said yes, that would be allowed, and I would still be able to serve and sit long courses in the Goenka tradition afterwards. And I think this needs a little bit of explanation for the people that don't know the Goenka tradition.
Right.
So. Yeah, in the Goenka tradition, if you meditate in that tradition and you want to sit longer courses than the 10-day course, like 20-day or Satipatthana course they have as well, or 30 or longer day, then you should commit to that tradition solely and not practice any other techniques. And there are actually no monasteries or so where this is practiced, but as Sayadaw had been a teacher in this tradition and had just started off, it was okay for me to go there and still keep that continuity of my Goenka technique practice going, and therefore I could come back to Europe and then also sit longer courses afterwards. So that's the one big reason why I wanted to go there. And the other reason was that I had heard that there were some nuns there, some Western nuns, whom I had also known as lay people in Dhammadvipa in England. So that's why I also wanted to go there too, because they were there.
Right. Yeah, I know the nuns who you're referring to. They were also big influences on my life. And Venerable Kanda has been a guest on this podcast as well. So that's what brings you there, something similar for both of us in terms of how it got on the radar and how we started to gravitate towards there. What was then your experience of spending extended time both at the monastery, which was a very, very powerful place for me and for others I know who came, as well as under the instruction and the guidance of Tabu Toya Sayadaw?
It was a very lovely experience. I told you already about the little talk I had in the beginning and when I ordained, but after that, there was a lot of care, a lot of compassion from Sayadaw to teach me, and to teach me also in English. So there was a lot of time that he spent with the monk who could translate to help me along on the path. And I very much appreciate that, and I have a lot of gratitude for him. To him for that. My name Vimala was also the name that he gave me, and so that's why I'm still carrying that.
Right. What stands out from that experience of you've had now up to this point in your life, you've had so many Buddhist and meditative and monastic experiences, and I'm sure they're all, as you think back and remember the different stages, there's different things that stands out as being distinct and giving you something here or there that helped you along the path and that was different from the others. So as you think about that monastery in Sayadaw, what really stands out with that?
That's a good question. I think it is also the first time I was in a monastery and I met a monk and could converse with a monk, even though through through a translator, and just being there and sitting there and feeling this compassion, that it was something very new to me, is this care and compassion that he gave me at that time. For me, that was something very special. I've never experienced that before, because it was so very different from all the Goenka courses I'd done before. So that really stands out for me, is that I can still visualize this image of me sitting there by his side and the translator monk on the other side.
Mm-hmm. Right. And how about Myanmar in general? Just especially coming from the Goenka tradition, where one hears, in that tradition, one just hears so much about Myanmar being the origin of the teachings of this lineage and this kind of spiritual homeland and everything else. And so coming and experiencing Myanmar, the country, the Burmese people, the different traditions, what was that like for you?
The one thing that really struck me was the kindness of the people. One time I went on Pindapata, an alms round with the monks. And as a nun, I was not allowed to carry a bowl, but I could walk behind the monks. And they would go to a nearby village, and there's about 5 kilometers walk, I think, on bare feet over the gravel. And the village was very, very poor, and people all came out, and they were so happy also to see me, even though I wasn't really going on alms route. And the ones that could speak a little bit English would say something. And I found it just such a beautiful experience. It's like the women would pick up their children, their little babies, to also guide them to give a little spoon of rice in the bowls to also make marriage. And there was just so much joy in that whole process. So, like my story before, when I got lost, people were just so incredibly kind. And before I came to Tae Phu Thai, I took a little sightseeing tour, also to the Goenka Center, of course, in Yangon, to also to the farm of Sayatechi across the river. And we stayed overnight at that farm. And there was a lady in the village. The farm was abandoned, but they gave us the key, and we could stay there. And there was a lady in the village that cooked for us every night. And we were complete strangers. And it was just so lovely, and so much kindness and care. That's just so unknown almost in the West. It really, really touched me.
And I think these stories are so important because, especially now, as you hear about the problems Myanmar is going through as a society and politically, and how much the economy has collapsed, so much of what is told about Myanmar in the media is about it being a failed state or needing all kinds of support, just really needing so much. And I think this then starts to give a kind of view or stigma to the country that it's just a place always in need. And when we hear these stories, the stories that you're telling, and so many, not just hundreds, but thousands of other foreign practitioners have shared in coming and being taken care of in this way, it starts to reframe the country in a more dynamic and multidimensional way, that it's also a giver, it's also a provider, it's also a teacher, it's also a place with extraordinary generosity. And I think it's so important to know those stories and acknowledge them and bring them out, that can balance that competing narrative that it's just a broken place that's always in need of more help, because this is true in some way, but yet it's also true that it's this extraordinary giver and welcoming people to come from all backgrounds, and just showering them with support and generosity, as you describe in some of these anecdotes.
Yeah, and I think that's really where the Buddhist teachings have taken hold in that country. It's like this lived experience of this incredible compassion, generosity, etc. And maybe that's just not all groups. I mean, the military, they seem to be some kind of outside group that are ruling out, trying to impose their power on the other people. But I could be completely wrong about that, but that's how it feels to me almost. I also remember when the cyclone Nargis struck, and the reports that would come out of Myanmar is that people would just go to take any car they could find, load it up in the supermarket, and go into that area to help the other people, to feed them. Nobody was like waiting to say like, well, the government should do something. Everybody was just immediately in action. It's like, oh, there's people there that need help, and we're going to help them. We're not going to wait for all kinds of official organizations to do so. We are going to help them. So yeah, all these things, they speak so much for the spirit of Myanmar. And yeah, that's what I found also so important in the help I could give to this organization I mentioned earlier, Compassionate Hands, to be able to go to villages and make a well for the village, make a school for the children, bring school materials so they could learn, etc., etc. There is this so much goodwill to help each other when you're in need, and this togetherness that you don't find so much anymore in our Western world.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very true. And as you talk about having to navigate through these different parts of Burmese society, I'm also wondering if there was, you mentioned, you frame at the beginning of your renunciate journey, how you were given this injunction on your ordination that you were not to talk about politics or government or, AKA human rights with your time as a monastic, which is really for your safety as well as the safety of the monastery. As you proceeded through your life in Myanmar and through your practice or travels or interactions with Burmese people, did this kind of intersection or conflict come again? Did you have other encounters that showed this kind of uncomfortable dynamic between the messy world and the corrupt, unstable society that was housing this beautiful tradition that you were also part of? And did that come into conflict at another point?
Well, I didn't stay in Myanmar very long. I've basically only been there for literally 2 months, slightly more, because of visa issues. And when I wanted to go back, I couldn't. So, and then my life took a different turn. So I haven't been there for very long, but I have been in contact also with people within Myanmar, as well as some of the Sayalays, who, like some of them have now come back to Europe to set up centers here. And it just seemed to be like the conflict seemed to be like around every corner in that time that I was there. It's like it could be around. You could make a remark, very well meant or whatever, and it could trigger a response of like, "Ooh, don't talk about that," kind of thing. And it really brought it home. It's like there's like people couldn't talk. And they also didn't want to talk to you if you talked about anything that was uncomfortable in that sense, because it could negatively impact on them. One time I was with my friend, I was sitting having a coffee or tea near the Swedagon, and a man joined us, and he was telling he used to work in Singapore, and he was a little bit more westernized. I had the impression, a young man. And then while we were talking, there was an old, stern-looking older man come to stand behind him, and then behind us, another one. And you're like, oh my God, we have to get out of here. And especially when these young men started a little bit talking about politics, then we thought like, okay, we have to cut this off, and for his safety as well as our own, but more for his safety. And we have to go. So we did, and we made an excuse and we left. But it seemed to be like everywhere, almost invisible. this danger of like constantly being watched.
Mm-hmm. And when you tell those stories about Cyclone Nargis, which I was also there for, it reminds me of a comment that a Burmese friend has told me about the current revolution, in just noting that they have, as a whole, the Burmese people have such low regard for their government and their authorities that they don't even really have a hope of being cared for by them or having any kind of welfare state or any kind of support. They simply want them to not interfere with them being able to survive. And so that example of going to support the people impacted by Nargis in the Delta, that was, as you mentioned, it was just Burmese people of all stripes from all directions, just getting in cars and boats and just trying to help out. And in many cases, the Burmese military stopped them. In some cases, the best scenario, they probably just sent them back. In other cases, they stole the goods that they were trying to deliver as aid and donations. And in the worst of all cases, they might have arrested them or made them pay a bribe. And so even just in taking actions to help one another and be able to improve their society on their own, I've had it explained to me, we don't even have faith that we can have a government that can actually do good for us. We just want them to not stand in the way of us trying to take care of ourselves. And so there really is that kind of supported community spirit. So getting back to the present moment and the Alms Bowl movement you're doing, it occurs to me that you're in this kind of uncomfortable intersection of that's brought about by this movement you've launched. I wonder if you've felt the reaction from any of these corners. So, like, on one hand, you're a monastic who is showing support and solidarity for Burmese monks and Burmese people at this time. And you've already mentioned how you had some pushback from some of the more traditional elements of the Sangha and Western monastics, people outside Myanmar that are saying this is the way that you're involved is perhaps not correct. But then within Myanmar itself, monastics don't really have a great name right now for a couple of reasons. One is the prevalence of nationalist monks and monks that have really been apologists and even blessed the military and have not stood with the people and have really gotten the attention, not just of the Burmese people for their stance, but over the course of the last several years of the wider international community. And I would suggest even that the way for people that don't know much about Burmese Buddhism and aren't so educated, that there's this kind of blanket suspicion that the entire Sangha leans towards nationalist and militaristic and anti-Islam. And so there's been these wider characterizations that the greater monkhood and Sangha within Myanmar is nationalistic. Basically, that's one concern. Another one is that among Generation Z and the protest movement that's developed in Myanmar, there's been a kind of feeling that because the monks have played such a small role in this current movement, that they're kind of irrelevant. That it's they just simply don't have much bearing. They're kind of a relic of the past that is not so critical for this current moment, the current moment that we're in. And sometimes when I've had Burmese guests on the podcast and I've asked them about the role that monks or nuns could play, I often get a kind of silence in the sense that they haven't really thought about it. They've started to see this segment of their society is so irrelevant because they haven't been involved, that they're not even really thinking anymore about what relation they could have or what role they could play. And so it's interesting to me that you're taking this on and you are potentially getting it from all sides. You're getting it from Western traditionalists who think that you're going too far. You're getting it from those in and out of the country that are seeing monastics as being something of a nationalist stooge based on a few firebrands. Unfortunate that they've gotten so much prominent attention. And then also just the growing irrelevance of the monkhood as seen by democracy advocates who don't see them as really joining them to the same extent that they are. So So as you take this action, really charting a different course than the stigma of these three different perspectives or prisms through which one might look at the Sangha, I'm curious, like, what reaction you might have gotten, or where you see yourself in your movement, or the type of monastic community that you want to represent, where you see that fitting in with some of these other perspectives that one has started to see of monastics in Myanmar, or monastics that are being engaged in social issues.
Well, I think that this coup has been planned for some time, and that there has probably also been some discussion about the Sangha, because the Sangha has always been very powerful and a very powerful force within Myanmar. And so that must have been some kind of worry, I would think. And you also see is that any monks who dared to stand up in whatever way faced faced repercussions in ways that they disappeared, were killed. We don't know what happened to them. That sends a very powerful message also to the other monastics, and it's like, stay out of this, or else. If you say anything at all, we will find you. And of course, that's very scary. Even just a simple action is like overturning the alms bowl, which was still a possibility to do during the monks' uprising in 2007, was an act for which you could get imprisoned or even killed. So I suspect that was one of the reasons why there's also a lot of silence, and why maybe monastics then think like, oh, the only thing we can do is turn to the Dhamma, turn inside ourselves, and just work on this meditation, our practice, and try and influence things in that way, in some way. Of course, there's also others that are very nationalistic and that are more on the forefront and might come more in the news as well, that people hear about. But I certainly refuse to believe that it's the majority of the Sangha.
Mm-hmm, right. Thanks for that. And I also want to come back to what you referenced a couple times in this conversation, where you've mentioned that you've actually been blacklisted to even return to Myanmar to practice. This is long before the coup happened. Can you describe the circumstances around that?
Well, I don't mean it so literally as being blacklisted. I don't know about that. Maybe I could go back, or maybe I can't. But as a bhikkhuni, there are no bhikkhunis in Myanmar, no fully ordained nuns, according to their own laws of the Ministry of Religious Affairs. Bhikkhunis don't exist. There have been bhikkhunis in the past, Burmese bhikkhunis, who have gone to Sri Lanka to get ordination. Only one of them, or maybe two that I know of, have returned. And the first one was immediately thrown in jail, have been stripped of her robes, they've tried to force her to say that she wasn't really a bhikkhuni, etc. But eventually, and I think under international pressure, they released her and put her on an airplane to Sri Lanka. She became a bhikkhuni there again, but due to the PTSD that followed, she wasn't able to retain that, and I think she has asylum now in the USA. So that's the situation of bhikkhunis in Myanmar. And I think for foreign bhikkhunis, it's sort of okay. They can't really do so much for you or against you, but you won't be accepted as a bhikkhuni. So that's a bit of the situation with bhikkhunis in Myanmar. So as that, I'm not accepted as a bhikkhuni to the Myanmar Sangha.
Did you try to visit and you weren't able to, or did you just realize that once you decided to become a bhikkhuni that wouldn't be possible?
It would be more difficult. I think there are some bhikkhunis that do go to Myanmar. Mahayana bhikkhunis, they usually don't have a problem because they're seen as Mahayana. And other bhikkhunis, I think that they just put on the robe of a sayalay and just, go to the country as a sayalay. And they can also, as long as they don't cause any problems, and they can go to the other, now I've never tried to come back to Myanmar afterwards. My life just took a different road. And as I ordained within a Thai Sangha, there's also the thing of not handling money and things like that, which is sometimes a bit difficult, I think, in Myanmar. So you have to have some lay supporters who can support you in that. And I haven't really tried to organize that or look for that.
Right. And for those listeners that are new to this is a really complex issue and something that we do want to devote more shows to looking at specifically, because it is quite important. But just to give the basic definition for those that might be a little confused, we're using these terms, bhikkhuni on one hand, and then on the other, tilashin or sayalay. Can you break down the difference in these terms?
Yes, of course, yes. So when I first came to Burma, I was also ordained as a tilashin, or also called sayalay, and that's basically on what's called 8 precepts. So you have 8 rules to keep. There's also another form of tilashin that keeps 10 rules, and there's 2 versions of that again. There's the papaja, which means the going forth, which means you don't handle money anymore, or there is the metta rule, which is also used sometimes. But this is a very long story actually, but I'll try to summarize it. At the time of the Buddha, bhikkhunis were the women who ordained, and they were ordained in a way that was the same as the monks, basically, and that lasted for quite some time, especially in Sri Lanka. But also in Sri Lanka, that Bhikkhuni order died out, and also the Bhikkhu order, the monks order, died out there because of famine and wars, etc. And they re-imported the monks order back from Burma, but not the Bhikkhuni order because it had never come to Burma in the first place. And so actually the Bhikkhuni order died out for about 1,000 years. And it's only in the 90s that it started to be resurrected again by several very brave women, especially in Sri Lanka, but also nuns like Ayya Khema, etc., who were pioneers in that field. But so what women did before that time, and also still doing, because the Bhikkhuni order is still very much in its infancy, and so most of the nuns that you see walking around in the white robed nuns in Thailand, and the Dasasila Mata in Sri Lanka, and also the Sayalays and Tilashin in Myanmar, they are not considered as equal to the monks. They are basically, the women wanted to ordain, they wanted to practice Buddhism as a monastic, but they were unable to because the Bhikkhuni order had died out. And according to the Vinaya, to re-establish the Bhikkhuni order, you need 5 bhikkhunis. So that doesn't actually work if there's no more bhikkhunis in the world. So the way it has been now re-established again is through the Mahayana nuns. And that is giving some problems because it is not recognized by a lot of the traditional monks. But so the women actually, they wanted something anyway. They wanted to ordain. They wanted to practice the teachings, and therefore they took up this sort of new form of 8 or 10 precept nuns rather than fully ordained nuns. And that has been like that for hundreds of years. So that's what you see when you go to Thailand, to Burma, to Sri Lanka quite often. But especially in Sri Lanka, the Bhikkhuni order is taking off more and more, and there is a couple of thousand Bhikkhunis there now. So there it's really flourishing, and it's also slowly spreading to other countries. There is some fully ordained nuns in Thailand and also in Western countries.
Right. So this goes back to how many precepts the monastic is keeping. This is really what it's centered on. And full bhikkhus are keeping 227 rules. This was laid down by the Buddha, whereas the Tilashin, Sayale, and we should mention Sayale literally means little teacher, can be translated as. Tilashin can be translated as like a master of virtue, master of Shila, for those that know the word. So these are more diminutive than a full proper monastic. And the issue at its core is that in a Buddhist society such as Myanmar, you get greater merit by being able to support those that are either attained or practicing a nobler path. If monks are supposedly following the 227 precepts, as we know, it's kind of counterintuitive because that's not exactly the case, that those are all followed so strictly. But if the belief is that they are following the 227 precepts, thereby giving to and supporting a monk, a bhikkhu, is providing greater merit for the person giving. And because there is no nun order, Bhikkhuni order, we should say, because of that, the nuns in Myanmar are only recognized at being able to follow 10 precepts maximum, and thereby their spiritual worth is lower than the monks, and they operate this kind of ambiguous zone between being a lay person and a spiritual practitioner who's renounced somewhat, and not quite being a full monastic. And this is, as we've mentioned, this is a whole other conversation to get into, the dynamics of this, of exactly where their ambiguity tends more towards the lay life and where their ambiguity tends more towards a kind of renunciate or spiritual life. But because they're not recognized at being able to follow more precepts, they are not able to ascend to these spiritual heights and be spiritual authorities, one can also say, in Myanmar society. So they're not honored or supported to the same extent as the monks. That's my general understanding, at least. Would you add anything to that?
Yes, absolutely, because this is a much wider issue. This is a worldwide issue of the Bhikkhuni order and how that fits in and what its history is than just Myanmar. The fact that Myanmar is still the most closed country to where Bhikkhunis are still not even accepted. As for instance, Sri Lanka is although it's officially not recognized yet in Sri Lanka, and neither is it in Thailand, the Bhikkhunis are there and they are being supported by the people there. While in Burma, it's simply not possible at all.
That's interesting. So you think that the life of a nun is perhaps more disadvantaged in Myanmar than other Buddhist countries? Is that fair to say?
It's definitely less equal. My own experience as a Tilashin was that there was a lot of support, but I don't think I can really speak from a very. I was in a privileged position there. I was as a Westerner, first of all. I think you get more support from than Burmese women who want to become Tilashin. I was also in a fairly rich monastery. So all these things play into it. So I can't really say how that situation is, but I have heard stories of nunneries in Burma that with hardly any support and food. And this was not just recent, this is an ongoing issue that has... and although you do see that same thing, you see happening also in other countries, for instance, in the Tibetan traditions. But I have the feeling that it's very difficult for women in Myanmar to take that path.
Right. Well, certainly an important topic, and one that this platform is going to continue to explore. We'll close off here for now in the space of this conversation. Coming back to the start of the talk, where we're going back to this movement, I want to go back to this kind of tension that exists between when you are a monastic, that on one hand, by virtue of being a monastic, you have renounced certain parts of the world, certain attachments, certain concerns, and have placed a spiritual path on a higher plane than the more worldly engagements. On the other hand, that's one part of the tension. That's the push of the push-pull. The other part of it is that there's also a commitment to that society and to those lay supporters. The Buddha was very clear in the rules he laid down that there was to be a reciprocal, ongoing lay monastic relationship. It would have been very easy to create a different set of rules where the monastics lived and functioned completely apart from lay society and were left to their own devices, in which case it would be hard to imagine how the monastic community would have survived one generation to the other. So by having that reciprocal relationship, that allowed the lay and monastic communities to grow over the years, as they've done for so many centuries and even millennium. But in the present day, there is that consideration. There is that question, that tension of where and how does one renounce and pull away, and where does one have a greater social engagement and commitment and responsibility to that society. And as someone who's been a monastic for so many years, and I'm sure you've thought about this issue, and then with Myanmar, with the movement that you started with the Overturned Alms Bowl, you thought about it even more because that was a way of social engagement. So how have you come to understand this dynamic for yourself?
Well, first of all, if you're not really on the one hand, you have to practice for yourself in order to see how this mind-body structure works, and to be able to pass that knowledge on to other people. You can't go and teach if you don't know what you're talking about, basically. So you can only teach what you already know. So that's why it's also important to find the truth within yourself. But also, while doing so, you notice a greater compassion for other people. And I think what's often this engaged Buddhism is called compassion in action. And that's basically what it is. You also feel this need to help other people out of suffering so they too can practice. And if you see people starving, you're not going to start teaching them how to meditate. You feed them first. So I think it's really important to also help other people and help our fellow people in Myanmar, because how can they sit quietly on a cushion and meditate and pretend while all these things are going on? And that doesn't work. You have to have some environment where it's safe, where you can practice. And so that's where compassion in action comes in. I think it is very important to help people to come to a place where they can practice the Buddha's teachings and make sure that those Buddha's teachings also live on.
Well, with that, I thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to share your background, your relationship with Myanmar, as well as some of the support that you've harnessed with your fellow foreign monastics, and just really great to get your voice on here.
Thank you very much, and it was lovely to be here, and wish you all the best with the enormously good work that you're doing.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Sabe Sata, Sabe Bana, Sabe Buddha, Sabe Bugala, Sabe Atababa, Pariyapana.
I know for a lot of podcast listeners, as soon as the fundraising requests start up, you kind of just zone out and skip ahead till it's over. But I ask that if you've taken the time to listen to our full podcast, that you also take the time to consider our spiel. Some may assume that producing a 2-hour episode wouldn't take much more time than the conversation itself. But so much goes into it. In advance of the interview, our content team reviews the biography and relevant works of the upcoming guest, and we discuss the best way to use our limited time together. After the interview is complete, the raw audio file is sent to our sound engineer, who shapes it into working order. A single episode can take several full days of solid production work in the studio, which is then carefully coordinated with our content team to ensure smooth listening. Further edits and post-production magic bring the eventual episode to your ears, along with extensive written descriptions of each interview, which we publish on our blog and on social media as well. Many of these steps require an outlay of funds in some way or another. We hope that each episode helps to inform you about the ongoing crisis. And if you find it of value, we also hope that you can consider supporting our mission. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go to support a wide range of humanitarian missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person, IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and much more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution for a specific activity or project you would like to support. Perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian aid work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org. That's BETTERBURMA.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit cards. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either the Insight Myanmar or Better Burma websites for specific links to those respective accounts, or email us at info@betterburma.org. If you'd like to give it another way, please contact us. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Puratimaya Disaya, Pachimaya Disaya, Uttaraya Disaya, Dakinaya Disaya, Puratimaya Anudisaya, Pachimaya Anudisaya, Uttaraya Anudisaya, Dakinaya Anudisaya, Hetimaya Disaya, Uparimaya Disaya.